this meeting. So we want to let you know that this will be public, so please be aware of that. If you'd like to turn your computer screen off, if that makes you more comfortable, please feel free. Also, this meeting, we have over 50 people, I believe, scheduled to attend. So we do want to let you know we are going to have question and answer time. We are already anticipating that we will not be able to get to everybody's questions today. And so I'm just apologizing in advance right now that you may not get your question answered. And if we don't, we will be putting up our email address and at the end, and we welcome questions that way as well. So we want to make sure that we get all those important questions answered. But again, we've got a lot of material to go through. We've got a lot of people here, which is a fantastic problem to have. And we're all happy to see you. So let me go ahead and put up my screen. Of course, it would probably help to start at the beginning. Come on. Okay, and some of the guests that we're going to have with us today are going to include Dan Hirsch, who is the president of Committee to Bridge the Gap. And he is a technical expert. There's nobody, I believe we can say this safely, nobody on earth who has as much expertise over 40 years working on the Santa Susana Field Lab. He'll be with us today. We'll also be hearing from Larry Yee, who's the former chair of the Los Angeles Regional Water Quality Control Board, and Jenny Knack and I, who are doing our best to keep up with the real pros here. And again, we'll be presenting and then we'll have question and answer time at the end. We've got you all muted right now. If you do have a question, we'll be taking those at the end, but if you just can't help yourself, go ahead and put it in the chat. That'll go to Jenny and I directly. And if we can, we'll answer it the best we can. So Jenny, do I need to make you the host now, or am I going to go through it? Bear with us through the technical difficulties. The one thing we did want to say too, and please hear us out, and I understand for some people this is going to be a little frustrating. If you are with the DTSC, Boeing, NASA, Department of Energy, BES board, or any other affiliated government boards with regulatory authority over the Santa Susana Field Lab, we'd ask you to hop off. This is really a community time. We would rather meet with you in a different situation. We really want to give this time and attention to our community members, especially as the DTSC didn't make any of this public beforehand. Seems pretty fair ask. So if you are, again, with DTSC, we saw some emails registered. If you are with Boeing, NASA, Department of Energy, or BES board, we'll have this recorded. You can always watch it later. We'd feel more comfortable with that. So we hope you can respect that and hop off of our call right now. And with that, I'm going to hand this over to Jenny Knack.
Melissa, are you going to do the slides for me?
Probably prefer if you did it, but let's see. If
I think I can if, let's see.
Yeah, we need to, and again, you guys, we're sorry that we're a little bit amateurish in this whole Zoom situation.
Can you see my screen?
Mm-hmm.
Okay.
Yeah.
So, folks, I appreciate your patience. I have actually not delivered the SSFL site history before. So bear with me, I will do my very best. And thank you for your patience. So I'm going to jump right in. I'm Jenny Knack. Like she said, I'm with Parents Against Santa Susana Field Lab. I'm sure many of you are very, very familiar with the site history, but if there are some people that aren't, it needs to be covered. So SSFL, the Santa Susana Field Lab, is formerly known as Rocketdyne, was established in the late 1940s for rocket testing by the AEC, the Atomic Energy Commission, that was looking for a remote place to do nuclear testing because the work was too dangerous to be done in populated areas. The SSFL site was ranked 5th out of 6th for meteorological safety, but it was picked anyway due to the convenient drive time to the local universities, UCLA and USC. This here is a map of the site. You can see the area 1 is Boeing in the top right. Boeing also has area 3, the little weird crane-like chunk in yellow on the left, and the southern buffer zone. NASA also shares a portion of area 1 in the top north portion. NASA also has area 2 in that light orange in the center. The northern buffer and area 4, the area of most of the nuclear work, is Department of Energy's responsibility. The location of the Santa Susana Field Lab is right in the middle of many communities. Over 700,000 people live within 10 miles of the site. The elevation is important. As you can see here, it's in the hills above the surrounding communities. You cannot see it from nearby because it's on a plateau. All the contaminants thus are drawn downhill by gravity, and you can see all the channels on all sides that can carry water and thus contaminants. This is an image of the lab from the plateau, and you can see that the homes of Simi Valley right over the edge. It's a great photo. SSFL was site to over 30,000 rocket engine tests. The significance, one of the main significances of that is that TCE was used as a degreasing agent for those tests. The plume of TCE still remains beneath the site. Over 500,000 gallons remain in the Chatsworth Aquifer. These are great images that Melissa has just recently received. We used to have these old fuzzy ones, so many of you probably haven't seen these. These are images of how workers at SSFL used to handle the chemical and radioactive waste at the site. They would shoot at barrels of contamination to explode them. The contaminants would thus go into the air and into the ground, spreading contaminants through smoke and probably drainage into the local communities, violating the existing environmental laws. Oh yes, this is the one. So this is the one we used to have that was super fuzzy and you couldn't really see, but this is them burning in the open air pits, the contamination, because it was cheaper than disposing of it properly. And Dan and Melissa, please jump in at any time if I'm missing things that need to be said. Two people were killed in explosions at Rocketdyne, and they were prosecuted by the FBI. The nuclear work in Area 4, I don't know how well you can see this. The base of the map is an image of the site and all the buildings on site. The labels are the facilities on site that did nuclear work. So you
within
can see that
Area 4 specifically.
Thank you. There were 10 nuclear reactors. 4 had major accidents. One that we know of was the 1959 SRE sodium reactor experiment where there was a partial meltdown. There were plutonium and uranium fuel facilities. There were multiple accidents, intentional and accidental accidents, explosions, spills, leaks, fires. And I believe there are 2 open air burn pits, is that correct?
One chemical, one radiation, but also some that was done off of these burned site areas.
And this is the most infamous experiment and accident that we know of. It's the partial meltdown that was discovered by Dan Hirsch's students at UCLA. The sodium reactor experiment that had the partial meltdown in 1959. It was not publicized. The public did not know. And because at that time the reactors weren't contained, the contamination was instead aired like a garage door opening to be able to go out into the open air to the surrounding communities. This is an image. I don't know if it's fuzzy for you. It's a little fuzzy for me, but this is an image of the actual rod with the cracks, and you can see the melting of the fuel that is not supposed to happen because thus it can escape this contamination. This is the actual document, I believe, that Dan's student had discovered that alerted them to the fact that there had actually been an accident and a meltdown at the SRE. There are 300 chemicals of concern at SSFL. They are not all regulated or monitored for, but they include some of the most dangerous substances on the planet, including plutonium, thorium, uranium, cesium-137, and many chemicals such as TCE and PCBs that are toxic, carcinogens, cause birth defects, and other health issues. Sorry. We thank you for joining us tonight. This is one of 4 town halls that we will be holding. The next one on August 2nd will cover the health impacts specifically. So we won't go on too much about that this evening. We will go into that in much more depth with Dr. Robert Dodge from Physicians for Social Responsibility at that town hall. If you have particular questions regarding health impacts, feel free to email us or contact us through our website. We will have the information at the end of the presentation. And we're happy to go into those topics at great length. We know that a lot of the community members have been impacted. So DTSC will often say that contaminants do not migrate offsite. And if they do, they don't in excess of levels of EPA standards or public health concern. But you can see here some of the contaminants that have been, what happened? Sorry, can you see my screen? Okay. You can see some of the contaminants of concern that have been found offsite, including lead, cesium-137, several hits of arsenic offsite, plutonium, 238. So in addition to the historic chemicals that were found offsite after the Woolsey fire, there was an independent study done to see if radioactive particles were coming offsite in the ash and smoke with the wind of the fires. And indeed, at that time too, we found a great distribution of contamination offsite. In fact, to the greatest extent of our sampling boundary, which I believe was 9 miles. And that was actually the hottest sample that they found. So we do not know the furthest extent of that radioactive contamination that was dispersed, but we know that it was. This is the contaminants in water that have been found off-site in wells and springs and seeps. As we mentioned before, there is the TCE plume, but it's more extensive than that. And again, to counter DTSC's argument that contamination isn't getting offsite and thus there are no health risks, because it isn't happening. We have many health studies to back up the opposite. Dr. Hal Morgenstern from the University of Michigan did a study that showed that the cancer incidence rate within 2 miles of SSFL was 60% greater amongst the residents than for folks living more than 5 miles from SSFL. There have been many worker health studies and many studies on those studies. So an extensive multi-year epidemiological study by the UCLA School of Public Health found significant increases in death rates among the most exposed workers from lung, lymph, and blood cancers. We have citations to these at the bottom of the page, but also if you go to our website, we have a tab on the parents' website with all the health studies, and you can go through at your leisure and peer through those. There was another federally funded study by UCLA showing that indeed, SSFL contamination does migrate over EPA levels of concern. And that was Yoram Cohen, also from UCLA. And Melissa, this is Grace, so you should take these.
Sure. Are you able to go full screen again?
Oh, am I not?
No,
Sorry. Should I stop share so you can share your screen?
Okay, sure. Okay, so.
Thanks for your patience, everyone.
Yeah, we really appreciate it. Hey, everybody, let's give a little love, a little Zoom love to Jenny right now. That was her first time presenting at one of these public town halls, and she's getting over a cold. So she's pretty fantastic. I think she should know that. So you got little reactions there. Go ahead and give her some love. I think she deserves it.
Thanks, guys.
I'm really proud of you.
Scary.
It is. It is. Still scary to me. Okay, so slideshow. Here we go. I'm going to go a little bit briefly through the cleanup agreements. For those who don't know, that there have been cleanup agreements in place since 2007. So the 2007 is one of the original cleanup agreements. It was called the consent agreement. Even though NASA, Department of Energy, and Boeing, which are the 3 responsible parties, signed it, this one kind of applies more to Boeing in the current state. So that's what we're going to be looking at, and how they have redefined what a residential with garden cleanup should be. So some of the key points of the 2007 cleanup was that it was signed by Boeing, NASA, Department of Energy. Sometimes we call them DOE. It would remediate the site to match Ventura County zoning. And that was really important because we needed a cleanup that would make it safe for the people who live nearby and do the kind of things that people living nearby do, right? It's not a industrial area. The surrounding site in Ventura County is very rural, very residential, agricultural, families, people growing gardens in their backyard. And so they wanted, when it's time to do the cleanup, that it would match that kind of lifestyle that people were living, because it was a heavy industrial area, but it wasn't in an industrial area. So that cleanup was scheduled to be completed by 2017. That would have been the complete soil cleanup, as well as a permanent groundwater remedy put in place. Obviously, that time has come and gone, and we're not in a better place. And so Boeing promised in 2015 that this would be a suburban residential cleanup. So there's different levels of cleanup, and they each get a nice little title. A recreational cleanup is one of the weakest cleanups because it would not, it assumes that you're only on site for a few hours at a time over, maybe like an hour a week on a hike. That's not very good for people who live nearby, because we literally share fence lines. People in Bell Canyon literally share fence lines with the Santa Susana Field Lab. So we needed something safe enough for the people who are residents nearby. But then Boeing in 2017 broke that cleanup promise and said that they were going to interpret this agreement to be significantly less protective in the recreational cleanup. This is despite this letter you see here from 2021. I put a little clip of it there, that it was the 2007 and 2010 cleanup agreements were very well supported by the public and local elected officials. So this is a letter of support from different local government entities, and regardless, this cleanup has now been destroyed by the DTSC. Here's a little clip. This is Jared Blumenfeld. He was the former chair of Cal EPA, and this is a promise he made us. Many of you were probably there during this workshop that we held a few years ago.
Those are legally binding. We will hold them. And as I said, but I will say it again, our job is to regulate, not
Oh, here we go. So, no, I don't actually want to watch it again. No, thank you. Come on. It's trying to be helpful. Okay, so this is again a commitment from the guy in charge, right? That this would be a cleanup that would thank you very much. Here we go. That they would not negotiate with Boeing, because Boeing, after they signed that agreement in 2007, they didn't want to actually do a good cleanup. Even though we were promised by the head of Cal EPA that they would not negotiate with Boeing over that agreement, shortly afterwards, the DTSC, which is under the Cal EPA, so there's the California EPA and then there's Department of Toxic Substance Control, the DTSC, they actually offered to go into negotiations with Boeing, which breaks promises. And obviously, why would the regulator need to negotiate with an entity if they already had Boeing over their knee? There was no reason that they needed to do that. We'll see why. If you're not shocked, you should be. So the settlement agreement, they said when we started to push back, when we heard about these negotiations, they started to say that, oh, this is in the wrong order. That they told us, here we go, that the DTSC said that they would not be making these negotiations into something we wouldn't like, that they weren't going to supersede the 2007 agreement, that they were going to uphold it, that these negotiations would be holding Boeing accountable. They said that it would go back out to the public for review, that this would be a very engaging process, like that this was going to be the golden child of negotiations. It was not. So the first statement we found out when we learned about this terrible, erroneously titled settlement agreement. A settlement agreement is a legal term. This is not a settlement agreement. A judge would have to preside over that. A judge didn't. They called it that just to try to make it sound more official than it should be. So the 2007 consent order, there it says, it's superseded by the settlement agreement. What a surprise, right? It's not that we didn't expect it, because DTSC had been showing some really bad trends. And yet, still when it comes, it felt like I got thrown in an Arctic plunge kind of a deal. I mean, I was depressed for days. And I know that Jenny and Dan, we were just so shocked that they would actually do that. We're not going to go deeply into the settlement agreement today. If you want, you can go find on our website. We have a whole video. We did a whole webinar just like this one, a town hall on it. And Dan Hirsch goes through it extensively. So if you'd like to go back and see that, that is on our website under the tab for settlement agreement. There's a video there, you can watch it. But here's the spoiler note. The settlement agreement destroyed the 2007 cleanup agreement. A residential garden, it is not. You can see that 179 of those chemicals were weakened. And you'll see here that, they did something outrageous, something called a multiplier. So what they did is they said, one, they were going to rearrange all the formulas, which we have tried to sit down with DTSC and tell them why their formula was incorrect. Again, you'll see that on that other video. But on top of making incorrect changes to the formula of how those chemicals were, decided on how much needed to be cleaned up, then on top of that, they put a 5 and 100 time multiplier for what? Oh, pardon my dog. Hey, you're not even supposed to be in here. Out. Sorry, guys. Sorry, he saw the kids in the pool and decided he needed to be a lifeguard. Can you still hear me okay? My apologies. I'm sorry.
Yes, we can hear you.
We don't get any more worse than this. Actually, we do. Okay.
You're on the multipliers. You
Ooh,
got this.
I'm blushing actually. I feel a little hot from that. Sorry guys. So the multipliers weakened the cleanup not only by 2 times, not by 4 times. 5 times would have been bad enough. But when you put that multiplier, you can see here the factor by which the cleanup standard has been weakened with that 100 times multiplier, we're seeing thousands of times weaker cleanup. That is not a residential cleanup. That is not a residential with garden cleanup. That is dangerous. And it only benefits Boeing, because if you have lots of contamination in the ground and you make a new law that you don't have to clean it all up, well, obviously you save a lot of money. And that's what we'll see this really comes down to. So in the settlement agreement, and this is important, just tuck this in your head for when Dan's talking, because this is where it's going to come into play. That settlement agreement last year that supersedes the 2007 agreement limits the amount of soil that can be remediated. And so that means no matter how much contamination they find, they have created a contract with Boeing in this settlement agreement. This is a quote, and you guys can check the links down below to see where we're exactly the page that we're pulling for. We're not making this up. They will not clean up more. So this has taken the cleanup and it has narrowed it down exceptionally, again, to save Boeing money. This is not based on trying to be more healthy for the environment. This isn't based on health for the people, certainly not. This is based on money. So you can see that it's pretty bad that under because there's a little bit of wiggle room in the settlement agreement, and it goes, you know, you can have bad or you can have horrible. Those are your 2 options. And so you can have 10% cleaned up or 4%, which obviously when we're talking about some of the world's most dangerous radionuclides like plutonium-239, and we're talking about chemicals that are now federally banned, they do extensive harm to wildlife, extensive harm to people, highly toxic. I mean, the people up there weren't making simple green cleanser, right? They were actually experimenting. And so these were the most dangerous of the most dangerous. They were experimenting with chemicals for making chemical lasers. They were experimenting with rocket fuel to make the most combustible rocket fuel. They were experimenting with radionuclides, right? So this 4% cleaned up is totally unacceptable. And then the 2010 agreement on consent. So there were 2 cleanup agreements. The 2007 had a little wiggle room of interpretation there, right? Well, the 2010 agreement cut that wiggle room out. It was an incredible cleanup agreement, possibly one of the most comprehensive cleanup agreements maybe ever signed, which could set a new precedent across America to what a health protective cleanup should look like, right? So this one, oh, that's incorrect. Sorry, I just noticed my mistake. Pardon me. It's NASA and Department of Energy. Boeing did not sign the 2010 agreement. The 2023 environmental impact report should have Boeing there because the PEIR encompasses Boeing as well. But so just ignore that side on the 2010 where it says Boeing. Only NASA and the Department of Energy signed the 2010 agreement of consent, which we call the AOC for short. So I'm going to go through that real quick. 2010 main points was signed by NASA, Department of Energy. It was not signed by Boeing. The soil cleanup again was supposed to be done by the fall of 2017 with that permanent groundwater remedy in place. Obviously, that has not happened. This time it set the contamination instead of saying, you know, well, maybe residential with garden, and then they had to do all these formulas to figure out, well, what's safe enough for people. You know, they just said, you know, we're going to draw a baseline, and that baseline is called background. Whatever is man-made, we're going to assume that's bad. And whatever is natural, well, okay, it's natural, we'll leave it there. So this is a background cleanup, which is a huge accomplishment. Unfortunately, it doesn't really matter now because DTSC has gotten rid of it. We'll see that when Dan goes through the PEIR. And again, this is now, instead of just local elected officials, this is our federal elected officials who supported the 2007 and 2010 cleanup agreements. Some of these people have supported it for decades. And this would have been a remarkable cleanup, you guys. Not only protecting us and our wildlife and our water, it could have set a new precedent across America of what good cleanups should be, responsible. The 2010 had something called exemptions in it, and biological and cultural exemptions. So these are, you can kind of think of it as like a clause, and Dan will clarify this a little bit more. They're very narrowly defined limitations to the cleanup, and they were to protect endangered plants and animals that do exist on the field lab, and cultural artifacts, because this site is a sacred site to many, I think 5 local tribes. Those, obviously nobody wants to see those get destroyed. You can never get them back. So the cleanup said that, okay, if you find, you know, a recognized cultural artifact like the Burrowfat's painted cave, you're not going to clean that up, right? We're not going to destroy it. If you find an animal that is defined as endangered, and we'll see here in a second, it has to be defined, right? It's not just, we'll call it endangered. It has to actually be through the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service. They have to issue a biological opinion, which is great. That's what they're good at. And then we would know, okay, don't touch that nest over there. Don't dig that hole over there. You know, those are endangered. And so that was a really kind of a remarkable feature of this 2010 agreement, that it took into account these very valuable assets at the Santa Susana Field Lab to protect them. That's always been there. That's been there since the 2010 agreement. So biological exemptions, in order to have these biological exemptions that were in the 2010 cleanup, first step is you have to have a biological opinion from the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, right? Check. The opinion would need to be included in the draft of the PEIR. It would have to be there to say, this is what areas you should avoid. However, it did not include a biological impact statement, a biological opinion. Okay, and this is an important part that we'll get to when you see the way that they've interpreted these exemptions. They were meant to protect the wildlife. Those exemptions did not exist in the draft version of this PEIR. Therefore, mitigation measures can exist. Mitigation measures are great. We saw some of them in this PEIR that include things like, you can't dig during these seasons because you could interrupt the nesting of, you know, the leaf-spales vero. Or it might say, you know, with the tar plants, it had a whole plan to reintroduce the tar plants after collecting seeds and then reintroducing it, so that way this native and endangered plant could survive the cleanup. Those are mitigation measures. NASA's done that before. They had to do a kind of like an emergency cleanup, and they had a whole grove of ancient oak trees at the Santa Susana Field Lab, and they dusted around the roots. They actually got the soil. Those are mitigation measures. Those are things to help make sure that the wildlife and cultural resources are protected, because those are valuable. So again, this is a really thoughtful cleanup agreement, the 2010. So you should feel devastated that that has been taken from us. It was never enforced, and then they took it a step further and they destroyed it. Here we go. So we're going to talk more next week, next Wednesday, specifically about the harm to wildlife that this new document that the DTSC has published, how this is going to actually make it dangerous for wildlife. So I hope you guys can join us. We're going to have a watershed scientist and biologist, Tevin Schmidt, joining us for that. We've got some really interesting points. So if you care about our local wildlife, this is a webinar you need to attend. We're going to really drill down into the meat of it. And now I would like to introduce Dan Hirsch, our expert and technical advisor for the Santa Susana Field Lab.
Thank you. I'm going to discuss the parts of the environmental impact report that was issued last month that break the 2010 agreements with DOE and NASA. So understand that those agreements, what we call AOCs, I can't see the screen now.
I'm sorry, am I moving the slides for you, Dan, or are you?
I don't have control over the slides and I can't
will
see them anymore.
Okay, I'm sorry, my mistake.
Bear with us while we reload the slides.
this is the sweatiest presentation I've ever given with technical blunders. I rarely blush, but I am blushing. Okay, slideshow. Dan, here we go.
So understand that the 2010 agreements required that the site be cleaned up to background. And what that means in simple terms is that the site was to be returned to the condition it was in before it was contaminated. As the 2010 agreement said, the end state of the site after cleanup will be background, meaning that at the completion of the cleanup, no contaminants will remain in the soil above local background levels. A similar commitment was made regarding Boeing under the 2007 agreements as interpreted by DTSC. But as you'll see in the next slide, the exceptions to this requirement to clean up to background were very, very narrow. They only can exempt from cleanup if there has been a U.S. Fish and Wildlife biological opinion for cleaning up to background that finds that cleaning up specific areas would violate one of two specific provisions of the Endangered Species Act. And so the issue is not merely, as Melissa indicated, that there was no biological opinion, including the draft. There isn't none now. Here's the actual language in the AOC. Only to the extent that Fish and Wildlife issues a biological opinion with the determination that implementation would violate those two sections of the Endangered Species Act and that there are no reasonable alternatives. There is no such biological opinion. There wasn't in 2017 when the draft was issued. There isn't one today. But as you'll see in the next slide, DTSC in the EIR, and put your seatbelt on, look carefully at this map because it's astonishing. DTSC has now proposed exempting the vast majority of the site from cleanup. The areas that are crosshatched, look in area 4 to the left, look in area 2, the NASA area. Those crosshatched areas are areas that were required by the AOC to be cleaned up. The colored areas, red, green, yellow, are areas that they're now proposing to exempt from cleanup. This is absolutely astonishing. And I want to remind you that the exemption would harm the very biological creatures that they are pretending to want to help, because it would leave the site contaminated in eternity, making those biological receptors always at risk of harm from these toxic materials. Next, please. And so the PEIR states that this is their estimate of where exceptions for significant cultural and biological resources would be applied. Remember that the biological exemption only applies if there's a biological opinion saying you can't do this without violating the law, and there is no such biological opinion. And the cultural exemption is only for Native American artifacts that are officially recognized. And artifacts are very small in size, talking about grinding stones, and things that no one was going to be touching anyway to clean up. But they've now proposed exempting 10% of the site by declaring cultural Native American artifacts to not be the exemption anymore, and expanding that way beyond what is allowed in the AOC. So this site that was important in the past and then polluted by white industrial activity, the same people responsible for that pollution are now insisting that it never be remediated. Next. Remember that, so the PEIR estimates that roughly 62% of the DOE and NASA contaminated areas would not be cleaned up to background under these new proposed waivers of cleanup. 338 out of the 541 acres would be exempted from cleanup by this one measure alone. Next. The AOCs also prohibit leave-in-place remedies, where you just leave the contamination in place. Yet the program EIR proposes monitored natural attenuation, which means leaving the contamination in place. They're breaking the AOC there as well. And they also propose, in some places, to simply bypass cleanup entirely and rely on land use restrictions. Put up a fence and a sign saying too dangerous for you to ever set foot in. That also violates the no leave in place requirement of the AOC. Next. The PEIR also eliminates from consideration the alternative of cleanup to background for the Boeing portion. Some of you may have seen a press statement by DTSC a year ago claiming that they had gotten a victory in that supposedly Boeing had agreed to at least clean up the radioactivity on its part of the property to background. Turns out that that too was false. The actual agreement and the PEIR allow much more than background to be left without cleanup for radioactivity. And the PEIR expressly eliminates, even from consideration, the alternative of cleanup to background for the Boeing chemical contamination, allowing instead greatly higher levels of pollution. Next, please. So the PEIR also violates longstanding commitments to clean up the site to standards safe for all uses allowed by Ventura County zoning and general plan. So the commitment that DTSC had made, not just for DOE and NASA, but for Boeing as well, was that they were going to clean up Santa Susana so much that it would be safe for any use that is allowed by the county zoning and general plan, both for the site itself and the areas around it. And this makes sense. We want it to be safe for all of the uses that actually can occur. Despite these promises, the environmental impact report rules out from consideration any alternative of cleaning up to that rural residential agricultural standard. Despite the fact that the land and surrounding areas are zoned to allow it, general plan allows it, and there is such use. As I said, DTSC had previously in writing committed that such a standard would be required and had said that that standard is equivalent to a cleanup to background. Next, please. So in addition to breaking the promises to clean the site up, instead now they're going to propose, they are planning to leave majority of the contamination not cleaned up. They've also broken their timelines. So remember that the original 2007 order required soil be completed, the cleanup be completed by 2017. 2010, the additional AOCs still required cleanup to be completed by 2017. But it took years and years before they even published the draft environmental impact report. They didn't publish it until 2017 when the cleanup was supposed to be done, but the cleanup couldn't start because they hadn't even published the EIR. In the following years, they kept promising that the EIR was going to be finalized shortly. 2018, they promised late 2018 to early 2019. In 2019, they said 2019. Then in 2020, they said 2022. In 2021, they promised that the final PEIR would be recirculated, meaning released for public comment to be able to review the new material they put in, and certified in 2022. But in 2022, DTSC and Boeing entered that sweetheart deal, that backroom deal, which gutted the 2007 order. They did that secretly without public input from the local governments or environmental review. And they finally, a year later, published the final PEIR last month and did it without recirculating. In other words, no opportunity for public input. This is body language that tells you that they know that what they're doing can't withstand scrutiny. So they cut the deal in secret with the polluter, and then they try to do an EIR after the fact to justify it, and don't permit local governments or the public to be able to review or comment. DTSC is now claiming that cleanup documents will be finalized and cleanup will begin some years from now. How much longer it will truly take is unknown, given the history of them breaking every deadline they've ever set and their coziness with the polluters that they're supposed to regulate. Next. So here's a summary. The the DTSC asserts that the EIR requires a full cleanup of Santa Susana. You may have seen their statements in the press. That is categorically false. The 2007 and 2010 agreements require such a cleanup, DTSC admits that those agreements are legally binding, but the final PEIR breaches those commitments regarding all three responsible parties, DOE, NASA, and Boeing, and allows large amounts of contamination to remain not cleaned up, putting people at perpetual risk. DTSC says that the final cleanup decisions haven't been made, and even if they stay on schedule, which has never happened, they are years away. But this is important. The assertion that they've made no decisions now is misleading. The PEIR sets a ceiling. The cleanup can be no better than the weak levels in the deals they cut. It can and likely will still be made even worse, resulting in even less contamination cleaned up. So it is true that when DTSC says they haven't made the final decision, whether it's going to be 90% of Boeing's contamination doesn't get cleaned up or 98%, that's true. But they've made the decision that 90% at least won't get cleaned up. And that breaks every commitment that was made for cleanup to background. Next. So a reminder, the EIR just out, based on the agreement from last year with Boeing, would leave a minimum of 90% of the contaminated soil not cleaned up, and perhaps as much as 98%. For the DOE and NASA, they have colored in the great majority of the site to exempt it from cleanup as well, despite the AOCs requiring cleaning up all contamination you can find, cleaning up all of it. Both promises have been broken. Next. So they broke their repeated commitments and they breached the cleanup agreements. Unless the reckless actions by the Department of Toxic Substances Control are overturned, the public will be at perpetual risk from the extraordinarily dangerous contamination that is not going to be cleaned up. Next. Thank you.
All right, we are going to hand this over to Larry Yee. He wants to share a little bit about his story. And right now, I just want to let you know and apologize that we're running a little late. So we're going to have time for question and answers afterwards. So stick around. Larry, are you able to join? I think we can just take off the screen sharing.
I'm here. Can you hear me? Good. Well, good evening, everybody, and thanks for joining us in your dinner hour. I guess this could be considered Zoom prime time. And, if your head is swimming with all of this detail and information, don't feel bad, because know that this whole Santa Susana situation is extremely complex, extremely complicated, filled with lots of technical information, lots of legalities, and lots of political ramifications. So there's a lot to sort through. And, thanks to Melissa and Jenny, and of course, Dan, they have been trying their best to keep you up to date and informed as the whole thing begins to unfold. So first, before I get to one simple action that I think you folks could take following this town hall, I just want to tell you a little bit about myself and how I came to be involved with this group of advocates for a full cleanup of Santa Susana. Last year at this time, or a little bit before, I was serving as the chair of the Los Angeles Regional Water Board. And it was during the time when the confidential mediation, which they promised not to do, was going on between DTSC, Cal EPA, Boeing, and the Regional Water Board. And I was not a part of that mediation. Our executive officer was. And so because it was confidential, I was not learning of anything about what they were discussing. However, toward the end of that, I became very concerned about the process, that this had all been done behind closed doors, and that we were not privy to what they were agreeing to, and the public, was not allowed to review or have input. So I became very critical of the process. And as a consequence, they asked me to resign. That was in May of last year. And then in August, when the Regional Water Board held the public hearing on the MOU between Boeing and the Water Board, which was a companion agreement to the settlement agreement between Boeing and DTSC. I appeared at that meeting, no longer as chair, no longer as a member of the board, but I testified at that time. They gave me all of 2 minutes and I testified. Some of you may have been there at that meeting because you also may have testified. But anyway, I recommended to the board that there was lots of problems with this whole thing and that they not approve the MOU. And had they not approved the MOU, then the settlement agreement would not have taken effect. But they did go ahead and approve the MOU. So I'm on the outside looking in now, and you know, I'm considered, I think, persona non grata, you know, when it comes to Boeing and DTSC, but I kind of claim that as my badge of honor now. So the next steps in this whole process, or I should say the next steps that might help in terms of getting a full cleanup, not the kind of cleanup that is being called for in the settlement agreement and that now has been conformed by with this EIR. It's really in the hands of our elected officials, our local elected officials, LA County supervisors, Ventura County supervisors, LA City Council, Simi Valley City Council. And we are just really hopeful that they will strongly and forcefully pursue their earlier positions and decisions to call for a full cleanup of Santa Susana. And so how you can help is you can simply send messages to them, send communiques to them, and say, hey, we support you in calling for a full cleanup of Santa Susana, and to do that as soon as possible. The next slide, please. So a simple message like this: I am concerned about the Department of Toxic Substances Control's recent Santa Susana Environmental Impact Report and how it will result in the leaving of over 90% of the soil contamination on site. I support the full cleanup of Santa Susana Field Lab as outlined in the 2010 and 2007 cleanup agreements. If you can simply just, you know, send this kind of message to our local electeds, it will give them, you know, more comfort and cover to do what they need to do, knowing that their constituents in the communities that are in harm's way are calling for a full cleanup. So that's it for now, for me. Back to you, Melissa.
Great, thanks so much, Larry. And so we have a few minutes for some Q&A. I'm going to start with, and by the way, if you're not on our email list, that's where we send out a lot of information that's really important. You can go on to our website, www.parentsagainst.sfl/newsletter, dig around our site. We've got everything there for you. So I'm going to direct this to Dan. Dan, this is coming from Kit Stoltz. As a responsible party, Boeing has overseen its part of the SSFL for decades. Presumably, they are recompensed, having a hard time with words today, by the federal government for their work. Do we know which federal department has been paying them, and how much have they been paid over the years?
Senator Feinstein, a number of years ago, was able to get a large appropriation that went to Boeing for doing work on the site in terms of the supposed remediation, which hasn't happened. I have the same presumption that you do, that Boeing is being reimbursed for any expenses, or would be, for the cleanup, because it did the work it claims under government contract, which is a kind of interesting circular reasoning, right? As a contractor, you should do it well, so there's no pollution. But if there is pollution, you get paid twice, once to create the pollution and once to clean it up. But I haven't seen the dollar amounts, and I think that would be useful to inquire. The money would be coming from one or more of the following three sources: U.S. Department of Energy, for the work that they did for DOE, NASA for the work they did for NASA, and what is rarely discussed, the US Defense Department, the Air Force, because much of the missile testing there was for nuclear missiles. And somehow the Defense Department was able to pawn off on NASA the obligations for cleaning up the missile test work. But that was the three entities that Boeing and its predecessors did the work under contract for primarily. And if they're getting paid for the contamination cleanup, that's not really happening. It would likely be coming from one or more of those parties.
Okay, if you have any questions, you can raise your digital hand. That's under the little reactions button. Should be at the bottom of your Zoom screen. And we will call on you, or you can ask a question in the chat. I know it was a lot of information to go over relatively quickly. So if your brain is just swimming, I completely understand that. Okay, this is from Jim. When did Boeing purchase Rocketdyne? I should know that. I don't. Dan?
I don't remember precisely.
Oh, Bonnie knows.
Bonnie would know, of course. Bonnie?
Oh, Bonnie, you're muted. I'm sorry.
1996.
And when they purchased the site, it was the intent to use it as a testing site. They bought it knowing it was contaminated and had hoped to do more. They were not given the permit to do more testing there.
Yeah.
Bonnie, do you want to give us a quick little hello about your background in this?
I used to work there. I worked at Canoga, Santa Susana, and DeSoto. I got bladder cancer many years after I worked there. The cancer I got was bladder, and that was the second in numbers to all the cancers. The biggest group of cancers was lung, and I don't know anybody who survived, but bladder cancer was the second, and most of them survived. Some people lost their bladder, which I didn't, but and that program is still going on, where anybody who had a relative that worked there who died of cancer, they can get compensated. And we are doing people that realized they had a grandparent who worked there, who died.
Bonnie was responsible for getting thousands of former workers compensated through this compensation program that was put in place by the Congress in large measure because of a series of studies that were done showing that workers at DOE sites, including in particular Santa Susana, were dying at elevated rates because of their exposures. She's a really unsung hero because there are thousands of people that can't get their health back or their loved one back, but at least they've gotten some compensation because of what she's done.
There we go. I was saying we're really glad to see you here today, Bonnie. I
Thank
put all the supervisor lists, the emails there for you in the chat. You can go through and if you're not sure which supervisor you're in which district, you can go online. They have a great map under Ventura County Board of Supervisors, and you can look up and see what district you're in. So you guys, it's just about 7:30. I don't see any more questions. If you have one last, oh, Bonnie, go ahead. Oh, I'm asking you to unmute. So could you hit unmute? There we go.
Do we know where the findings that we found recently with high levels of radionuclides, do we know where they're coming out? Are they going into Simi, Bell Canyon? Are they coming down into the reservoir?
Are you talking about the groundwater study, the recent groundwater study?
Yes.
We're going to go through that, especially in a few weeks. We'll be looking at that study.
Right, and I won't be here. Will you have that recorded?
Yes.
Yes. Okay.
Bonnie, we'll make sure we get that information to you, okay?
So again, it's really important that you contact your elected officials. You have to remember we have to counter Boeing's influence. And that happens when their constituents say, hey, remember I voted for you and maybe you're thinking about reelection. Just a reminder, this is really important to us. It goes a long way, actually. You can also let friends and neighbors know. It's still shocking how few people know that this site exists, even when they get rare diseases. And if you would like to become further involved to ensure the Santa Susana gets completely cleaned up, Michaela, I'm looking at you. There's a newsletter that you can sign up for. We keep current actions going. If you would like to get even more involved, we're calling it the Santa Susana Peace Corps. I'll send out a follow-up email for everyone who signed up today on different tasks, things that you might enjoy doing. We could use a lot of help making phone calls or sending emails or writing letters to the editor. If you're good at underwater basket weaving, we'll find a way to make that relevant to the work we're doing here, because we need everybody on our team. And we're really grateful for all of you who are here. I've got one more question from Jonathan. In Area 4, there are still buildings that you can see from Sage Ranch Park. These buildings include 4001, 4009, and 4055, which are owned by Boeing. Do we know when these are being cleaned up / demolished? This is terrifying that Dan is dealing with this right now. So Dan, do you want to answer that?
So there are roughly 5 remaining Boeing nuclear buildings in Area 4. One of them is the plutonium building. And as we mentioned, plutonium is arguably the most dangerous material on Earth. A millionth of an ounce, if inhaled, will cause cancer with a virtual 100% statistical certainty. Boeing has been insisting that it be permitted to tear down the buildings and dispose of the waste anywhere it wants, that it doesn't have to send it to a low-level radioactive waste site. And in fact, in the past, they have torn down radioactive buildings, and the radioactive metals have been sent to metal recyclers in Ventura County and in Long Beach, getting melted down into the consumer metal supply. So you could be wearing a belt buckle or a zipper or eyeglass frame that may have come partially from a radioactive reactor. They recycled concrete and asphalt in Ventura County recycling facilities. They disposed of radioactive waste in municipal landfills and in hazardous landfills not licensed for radioactive waste. And the position of the Toxic Agency and the State Department of Public Health is that Boeing is free to do whatever it wants to with that waste. Some of you may have seen Joel Grover's piece on NBC some months ago with footage of the Department of Energy blowing up with explosives the last of their radioactive buildings. They thought it was somehow so cool to blow it up that they filmed it. So we're very worried as to how the remaining buildings will be torn down, but most particularly where the waste will go. And there is currently a petition before this California Supreme Court pending to have them take review of the court decision to be able to prevent that stuff from ending up in places not licensed for it. So it's just astonishing to me. I frankly, I've followed this for 44 years, trying to help this community. It is hard to understand an entity that will pollute a site so badly and then stick its finger in the eyes of the community by blowing up radioactive buildings, by shipping radioactive waste. There were modular buildings in Area 4, the nuclear area, that they sold to a school district in San Luis Obispo that Senator Boxer had to intervene and get them removed and disposed of in an appropriate disposal site. It's almost as though they're purposely trying to break every rule because they get a sense of their power, their freedom, their lack of concern for general public health. So if there's anything that you need to understand about the complex tables that were presented or any of that, don't worry about it. Watch the body language. Blowing up radioactive buildings and filming it, sending stuff to metal recyclers, cutting deals in secret, keeping the counties and the city out of the loop, but meeting in secret to cut a deal with the polluter, relaxing cleanup standards by tremendous amounts. And it's almost as though there's a joy from it. I should not be saying this, but the conduct, there seems to be a sense of freedom to be able to break the normal bounds of human decency. Each of you tries to behave in a normal, moral way to your neighbors, but you've got a very big neighbor in your neighborhood, and that's the Santa Susana Field Lab, and the people who run it are not acting as good neighbors, but as very dangerous threats to each of you. So all we can say is that it's an unequal battle, but it is worth fighting.
Yeah, Dan, I think you're exactly right. You really, that for me, I'll just say real quick, that was the first thing that before I knew anything, the first meeting that I ever walked into with the DTSC, they told us that they had used hypothetical numbers in the 3-hour public presentation they had made. And I went up and said, why did you use hypothetical numbers? Have you not done the studies yet? And they said, oh, no, we just, it's all really complicated, but you can trust us. And I almost threw up, because I may not know rocket science, but I do know if you're at a public meeting, you don't have to hide the numbers if you've got facts you're not afraid of. So Dan has hit the nail on the head with that. And also that, they don't value our lives. Our lives of being the little people are not valuable to them. And we know our value, we know our children's value, and that's why we're going to keep fighting. Julie, I'm going to get to your question now, and then I think we might have to wrap, you guys. It looks like Marissa might also have one. So Julie, go ahead and unmute yourself.
Can you hear me? I unmuted myself. Thank you so much. I'm always have to take a breath of air, because there's so much information. Although I've heard so much of it through the years, I'm still in shock every time I hear it again. And I have been following all of you, Dan, for probably 30, 40 years now. And like I said, I've got to take a breath. But what I wanted to mention, my sister happened to have called me a couple of weeks ago, because a close friend of hers was getting ready to put her name on a list for like a retirement village, beautiful retirement village in Simi Valley. And of course, my antenna went up, and then I found out it was right near the Brandeis University area. Yeah, Dan, you're shaking. I mean,
I'll explain why in a moment.
Yeah, and my sister said this is wonderful, remarkable group, and they're progressives, and you should look into it, because maybe you want to, meaning me, look into getting on the waiting list. And then I said to her, it's really a bad area. They really need to look into it. And then she said something, yeah, but it's going to all be okay. It's going to be cleaned up, et cetera, et cetera. Okay. And then a relative of mine just recently put a down payment down on a townhome in Simi Valley, more central, more west, but I'm so worried about it, because when you have some knowledge, it may not be a lot, but enough to know that this is an issue. And I'm wondering, when people are buying property today, do they get a warning that this site is there and it's contaminated, and what is actually happening? Or do they just sell the property?
Well, I can tell you that they do get a 2-sentence warning in their paperwork when they're buying. I know, because that's how I learned about the Santa Susana Field Lab. I also know that the lady I actually stopped and I was like, what is this? I have no idea what the Santa Susana Field Lab is. And she said, oh, honey, don't worry. It happened a long time ago. It doesn't bother anybody anymore. Trust me, I live here. We're all fine. They just have to put that in the paperwork. So I trusted her. That was my warning. People who rent don't get any warning. It's obviously there's this unspoken philosophy, I think, among regular people like myself, is that if it was dangerous, they wouldn't let us live here. And it turns out there is no good they. And absolutely, if there's money to be made, they will let us live here. And they will push it to the farthest boundary. Last question. And again, thank you everyone for sticking around and for the kind words that I'm seeing in the chat. Marissa, Dan, this is for you, or Larry. When is it expected? Marissa, go ahead.
Could Dan respond first? Because I
apologize
about the Brandeis and all of that. I
yes.
Dan expression. So I just wanted to hear what he had to say, please.
My apologies. Go ahead.
Julie, I lived for some years in a Trappist monastery on the Lost Coast. And a friend who is one of the monks there, Marisela, sent me an email a few weeks ago about a Zen-inspired senior retirement village being constructed in Southern California. And I was interested, you know, I'm decrepit, and Zen sounded very attractive. And then I found the location, and you couldn't be, there must be some kind of dark sense of humor to the universe. For me to spend my remaining years, you know, in the midst of the strontium, the plutonium, I'm not saying that their site is contaminated, I don't know their site, but that whole area is right beneath the field laboratory. So I just, you know, the bottom line is you can't escape these things. You have to fight to fix them. You can't run away from them. They are, so I was just smiling because it was something that in my own life, a marvelous friend, a woman who's a monk in a Trappist monastery, was calling my attention to this Zen-inspired place that turns out to be right where I have wasted 44 years of trying to get a site cleaned up.
Yeah, and I have really bad news for you. You're not ever allowed to retire. I just want to put that out.
I'll be shot, so that'll make it easier. Anyhow, we had one more question, it seemed.
Okay, Marissa, did you want to unmute or?
Sure, it's pretty not simple, but pretty direct question. And it's, is there a timeline? Is there any kind of thoughts on when the supervisors may make a decision? Like how much pressure do we, I mean, obviously we should put it right away, but has there been any discussion? Is it on books at all, or where's that at?
Larry, do you want to respond to that, or?
Again, like I said earlier, the local electeds are trying to decide exactly what action to take. They're focusing on legal action based on their past decisions, you know, to call for a full cleanup. So that's all being explored right now. I would just suggest that there's probably no great rush, you know, to do anything really urgent, but you know, in the next little bit, while decisions are being made, just exactly how to proceed. So it would just give them a little added level of comfort to know that there are peoples out there that are concerned. Does that answer your question, Marissa?
Yeah, I guess I'm just, so they're discussing it. There's nothing on the, is the process, will they open it up to public comment? Are you familiar with that part of it? Is it going to be on the books that way, or is it more going to be announced where they stand without comment?
This is not, unless they discuss this at one of their regular meetings, this is all going to be done, you know, behind closed doors between the supervisors and their county councils or their attorneys, for instance. So again, and there's nothing really to comment on, Marissa, at this point.
But Marissa, when there is, we will absolutely be, you know, alerting everyone who is active, and we will be organizing public comments at those meetings when it's time, and we will definitely be contacting you.
Marissa, I think we may not be being as clear as we should be with you. LA County Board of Supervisors, Ventura County Board of Supervisors, and the City Council of Los Angeles have all passed resolutions that are already in effect, directing their attorneys to prepare for litigation should the responsible parties and DTSC fail to move forward with the cleanup to background that was promised. So we don't have to convince them to adopt a policy. They've already adopted it. The trick is to let them know that you really want them to carry that policy out now that the EIR is out and it breaches all of these agreements. So Larry's correct. There's not a deadline if you have to do this, the next hour. But since we're talking about sending an email to one county supervisor, whoever represents you, or if you're in the city of Los Angeles, to a city council member that represents you, I would just urge you to, by the end of the week, send in that email. There is, under CEQA, there's normally a 30-day period in which you have to file a lawsuit if a notice of determination has been issued by the agency. DTSC is desperately trying to avoid being sued, and so they didn't issue a notice of determination. That means there's 180 days in which to sue normally. So this may be digested for a little while by each of the local governments as their attorneys advise them what to do. But that means if I were in your shoes, I would send something in the next couple of days and maybe then nudge them again in a few weeks. But they've already gone on record taking the appropriate policy. You just want them to now live up to it.
But Marissa, here's the important thing. When those resolutions and decisions were made, a year, 2, 3 years ago, it was with a different set of electeds than who are in place today. So all of the electeds in the past may have been of one mind, and we're really working together on this, but now we have a different set of electeds. For instance, here in Ventura County, there are 3 new supervisors. So if these newly elected folks hear from you, I think it would really help.
Well
That's
said.
really helpful. Thank you so much for the details, Dan, and also for the encouragement and to know that, okay, so within, 6 months, maybe 5 months from now, hopefully they'll make those decisions. And I know there's been a lot of change in Ventura County, at least, so we need to really amp it up.
It was a 5-0 vote on the prior board. It was a unanimous vote for the LA County board. So things should remain the same, but the real way to guarantee they remain the same is for them to hear from you.
Right.
Tell you what,
And from your friends.
Excuse me, everyone works better on deadlines. So I'll tell you what, I'll give you one. How about by the end of the month, you send something in?
That's helpful. Thanks.
That's definitely how I work. So everyone, thank you so much. Let's give a round of applause for Dan and Larry making themselves available. They're very, very busy. I know that their time is exceptionally important, and they shared it with us in our community today. We really, really appreciate that because this is it's the kind of thinking and analysis that our community could not do alone. So we're very, very grateful, especially to Dan and his team for going through thousands of pages of documents, scouring this, making sure that, that we're not blindsided by the DTSC. They should be the ones doing this. They should be the ones protecting our community. They have not. And Dan and Committee to Bridge the Gap has filled those shoes, and they're helping protect us. So that way, other kids don't get cancer, and family members, friends, that we can be healthy and move forward like we should, like a community. So thank you again, everyone. We'll follow up with emails. Feel free to email us with any questions that we didn't answer. We hope you can join us next Wednesday at 6:30. Again, we'll be talking about particular harm to wildlife because of this new PEIR and the new standards that they have adopted that will put wildlife, especially not more risk than humans, but more risk than they were at with the original agreement. So again, thank you guys. Good night.